The morning began like any other, calm and quiet, with the water of the marina sparkling under the first rays of sunlight. I walked down the dock, enjoying the peacefulness, until I saw smoke curling into the sky. My steps quickened, my chest tightening as the smell of burning fuel reached me. By the time I reached the end of the dock, my heart sank. My boat, the vessel I had poured years of sweat, money, and love into restoring, was nothing more than a roaring inferno. Flames consumed the wooden frame, crackling loudly as thick black smoke rolled into the air. Bits of charred debris floated across the water's surface, carried away by gentle ripples, like the final fragments of my hard work drifting into nothingness. Neighbors stood at a distance, whispering and pointing, their faces a mix of fear and curiosity. No one came forward to help. They didn't have to say it. I already knew who had done this. The HOA board had been breathing down my neck for weeks, demanding that I remove the boat from the dock or pay endless fines. I had refused, unwilling to let bullies dictate my life. Their threats had grown sharper, more personal, and now I was staring at the result. This wasn't an accident. It was a warning, a message meant to scare me into submission. But as I stood there, staring at the wreckage, something shifted inside me. The fire that destroyed my boat lit another flame, one they could never control. I wasn't just angry, I was determined. If they thought this would break me, they were wrong. They had crossed a line, and they had no idea just how far I was willing to go to make them regret it. In the hours that followed, I watched the flames finally die under the spray of the fire hose, leaving only a blackened skeleton bobbing in the water. The marina smelled of scorched resin and smoke, a smell that clung to my clothes and skin. As the firefighters packed up their equipment, the last person I wanted to see arrived. Karen, the HOA president, strutted down the dock in her tailored suit, her face set in an expression of mock concern. She clutched her clipboard like it was a badge of authority, her eyes flicking toward the remains of my boat before settling on me with a smirk she tried to hide. "I'm so sorry this happened," she said loudly enough for onlookers to hear. But when she leaned closer, her voice dropped to a sharp whisper. "We warned you. Some people don't listen until it's too late." The words stung, not because of their meaning, but because of the casual cruelty with which she said them. I pulled my phone from my pocket and made sure the screen was recording. Every word, every sneer, every glance captured. Her face shifted when she noticed, but she didn't stop talking. She thought she was untouchable. The police officers on scene scribbled in their notepads, their tone dismissive when I tried to explain. Without hard evidence, they claimed, it was impossible to prove the HOA's involvement. Their indifference was almost worse than the fire itself. I knew the board had connections. Favors and friendships went a long way in small towns like ours. But I didn't feel powerless. Not anymore. Karen thought this was the end of my fight, but she was wrong. I wasn't just some homeowner clinging to a boat. I had skills, experience, and knowledge she couldn't imagine. They had lit a fire, but I was going to burn down their entire operation. Legally, strategically, and completely. I started digging that night. Through public records, financial filings, and court documents, I traced the HOA's financial operations. What I found shocked even me. Misappropriated funds, fake maintenance contracts, and offshore transfers hidden under community improvements. They weren't just bullying homeowners, they were laundering money. I compiled everything into a secure folder and began drafting a report. My boat might be gone, but their empire would crumble. I began by pulling property tax records and minutes from board meetings. Names repeated across vendors. The same shell company kept appearing on invoices. A landscaping firm that never showed up to do the work. A maintenance contractor whose reported expenses outpaced reality. Checks signed and rerouted. I cross-referenced bank filings with public contractor licenses and discovered large wire transfers timed suspiciously after community fund allocations. Each thread led to another, and soon the pattern was undeniable. Kickbacks, inflated invoices, money siphoned into private accounts. Late into the night I mapped the network on a whiteboard, connecting names, bank branches, and P.O. boxes. The board's treasurer was a hub. He had withdrawn sizable sums in cash, explanations vague and poorly documented. I found a dormant LLC controlled by Karen's cousin, which had received multiple payments for permit facilitation. Emails I subpoenaed from an old case showed cozy conversations about splitting savings. I saved copies, encrypted them, and distributed backups across multiple drives. As I worked, I realized how complacency had allowed this to grow. Neighbors trusted the board. They signed checks and nodded through audits. That trust was their cover. I had to be surgical. I organized the evidence, prioritized the most damning items, and began sketching a legal timeline. They had burned my boat to scare me. I was going to use their own paperwork to bring them down. I felt cold resolve settle in. This was no. They didn't stop after the fire. If anything, their tactics sharpened. A week after the blaze, a thick envelope arrived with no return address. A terse letter threatening lawsuits and fines if I continued to provoke the community. Another night. A car idled at the end of my driveway long enough to rattle my windows. The driver disappeared whenever I reached for my phone. Someone tried to cut the power to my garage, and anonymous calls left messages designed to keep me off balance. The board's harassment moved from bureaucratic pressure to direct, targeted intimidation, and it was intentional. Karen escalated in public and private. At a homeowner's meeting, she lobbed thinly veiled accusations about liability and safety, painting me as reckless. Privately, she sent emails filled with legal jargon and veiled threats, the sort of language meant to exhaust people into silence. My mailbox filled with notices demanding documents I had never been asked for before, subpoenas with questionable signatures, and petty fines that arrived like small, constant pinpricks. They were trying to force me into a maze of paperwork and cost. I refused to be her easy target. I installed cameras at the dock and around my property, careful to cover blind spots without trespassing. Every interaction I had with board members was recorded where legally allowed. Every letter was scanned, time-stamped, and stored in multiple encrypted locations. I set up automatic backups and a secure cloud vault. When a neighbor whispered that a contractor the HOA recommended had been around asking pointed questions, I made notes and took photos. I kept a written log of every strange occurrence, dates, times, license plates, names, building a chronology that no one could dismiss as paranoia. The more they pushed, the more mistakes they made. Overreaching threats were sent to the wrong recipients. Menacing posts meant for private group chats were accidentally forwarded to public forums. Their aggression left. I knew I couldn't take them down alone. The evidence I'd collected was damning, but without someone with authority to act on it, it would just be a folder of documents sitting on my desk. That night, I pulled out my old contacts list from my time as a financial investigator and found the name I'd been thinking about since the fire. A senior investigator at the state's attorney general's office. Years ago, I had helped her crack a major embezzlement case, and we'd stayed in touch over the years. If anyone could cut through the HOA's web of influence, it was her. When I called, she picked up on the second ring. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I told her about the threats, the fire, and the records I'd uncovered. Her voice stayed calm, but I could hear the edge of interest creeping in as I laid out the numbers, the fake companies, and the offshore transfers. By the time I finished, she said she wanted to see everything. We arranged for me to send encrypted files the next morning, and to meet in person later that week. For the first time since the fire, I felt a flicker of hope. In the meantime, I began quietly warning my neighbors. Some were frightened, glancing nervously at their front doors before whispering their thanks. Others were angry but hesitant to go public. I encouraged them to keep records of their own experiences. Every fine, every letter, every threat. Slowly, the isolation I'd felt began to break. People who had once avoided me on the street now stopped to share stories of harassment. Karen's control, once so complete, was beginning to slip. I spent that evening organizing my evidence into timelines and charts, preparing it for investigators. My boat was gone, but the board had just handed me a reason to expose their empire. Their power was cracking, and this time I wasn't fighting alone. The HOA board thought they could end the fight by making an example out of me. A notice appeared on my door one morning announcing an emergency hearing to determine whether my continued non-compliance warranted removal from the community. It was pure theater. They wanted to humiliate me in front of my neighbors, to show what happens when someone resists. I didn't shy away. I prepared like I was going into court. My files were neatly organized in binders, with every bank transfer, invoice, and email flagged. I even set up a small hidden camera to stream the entire meeting to a secure server, knowing they'd try to twist my words later. The meeting was held in the community center, a bland room that suddenly felt like an arena. The board sat at a long table under a banner about community values, their expressions tight. Karen took the center seat, flanked by her allies. The room was full. Homeowners packed the chairs, murmuring and looking uneasy. Karen started with her usual speech about rules and order, but I could see a flicker of tension in her eyes. When it was my turn, I didn't argue about the boat or the fines. Instead, I opened my binder and began presenting their own documents back to them. Contracts with shell companies, payments routed through dummy LLCs, and inflated invoices signed by board members. Gasps rippled through the crowd as I laid out the pattern. Some board members shifted uncomfortably. One of them dropped his pen. Karen tried to interrupt, but I held my ground, calmly reading aloud from their own records. By the time I finished, the room was silent. Even those who had doubted me were staring at the board with new eyes. The narrative had shifted. This wasn't about me breaking rules. It was about the board breaking the law. For the first time, I saw cracks in their composure. They'd wanted a spectacle to crush me, but instead they'd handed me a stage to expose them. By the time the meeting ended, I knew the board was in trouble. The silence that had filled the room wasn't just shock. It was the sound of neighbors realizing they'd been lied to and stolen from. That same night, I got a call from my contact at the Attorney General's office. She told me they had enough to move forward with subpoenas. My evidence had opened a door, and once the state investigators stepped through, the board would have no way to close it. Within days, the machine started turning. Notices were delivered to the HOA's treasurer and secretary, demanding financial records. Banks received orders to provide transaction histories. A quiet storm was forming, and Karen had no idea just how quickly it would hit. I watched from my porch as board members gathered in hushed conversations on the street, their faces pale, their confidence shaken. They had always operated with a smug sense of immunity, but now the law itself was bearing down on them. The HOA's attorneys tried to mount a defense, sending intimidating letters to homeowners and warning of serious consequences if anyone cooperated with investigators. But those threats rang hollow now. People who once cowered under their rules began to share stories of inflated fines, sudden liens on their homes, and harassment for imagined violations. The more they spoke, the more the investigators listened. Then the real blow came. The first freeze order hit one of the HOA's secondary accounts. Contractors stopped showing up. Landscaping crews walked off the job unpaid. The illusion of control started to crumble. Karen had torched my boat thinking it would make me crawl away in fear. Instead, her board was the one drowning, flailing as the financial lifelines they'd relied on were cut off one by one. Their empire was beginning to collapse, and all I had done was hand over the truth. The deeper the investigators dug, the uglier the picture became. What had started as suspicious invoices and shady contracts quickly unraveled into a full-scale fraud operation. The HOA wasn't just mismanaging funds. They were running it like a personal cash machine. Kickbacks flowed through fake vendors, inflated bills funneled money into private accounts, and community dues were siphoned to pay for vacations, luxury cars, and even the down payment on a lake house Karen kept hidden under her brother's name. The most damning evidence surfaced in the form of emails. Investigators retrieved a trail of correspondence between Karen and her cousin, who operated one of the contracting companies. In plain language, they discussed splitting profits and fabricating receipts. One email even contained a casual line about keeping the neighbors too scared to ask questions. When that line was read aloud in a preliminary hearing, even the most skeptical residents felt the chill. Word spread fast, and the neighborhood atmosphere shifted overnight. People who had once avoided eye contact with me now came to my porch to thank me. Families who had quietly suffered under endless fines shared their stories with investigators. Harassment complaints piled up, and suddenly, it wasn't just my voice against the board, it was dozens. The local media caught wind of the scandal, and within days camera crews were parked outside the HOA office. Reporters shouted questions as Karen tried to leave board meetings, her once smug face plastered across the evening news. "Where's the money, Karen? became the question on every microphone. For years, she had hidden behind rules and authority, but now those same walls were closing in on her. The story was no longer about one burned boat. It was about corruption, greed, and intimidation infecting an entire community. The spotlight was on her, and there was no way to dim it. It didn't take long for the pressure to crush the board. Within weeks, the Attorney General's office obtained a court order to freeze the HOA's primary operating account. The moment that order was served, the gears of their so-called authority ground to a halt. Checks bounced, automatic withdrawals failed, and their lawyers, once so quick to send threats, suddenly demanded payment they could no longer provide. The HOA, which had thrived on fear and financial muscle, found itself stripped of both. Karen tried to rally her allies, calling for emergency meetings and urging board members to stay strong. But panic spread faster than loyalty. The treasurer, faced with subpoenas he couldn't ignore, resigned abruptly, leaving behind a folder of damning ledgers. The secretary followed soon after, turning over emails in exchange for leniency. What had once been a united front splintered into self-preservation. Everyone was looking for a way out, and no one wanted to sink with Karen. Meanwhile, the homeowners felt the change immediately. Harassing letters stopped arriving in their mailboxes. The daily patrols that once prowled the neighborhood vanished when the contracted security firm walked away unpaid. For the first time in years, people left their homes without feeling watched or judged. Conversations that used to be whispered were now spoken freely in driveways and across porches. Karen, stripped of her power, became a ghost in her own kingdom. She avoided eye contact, darting from her car to her door under the watchful eyes of neighbors and news cameras alike. Her reputation, once feared, had crumbled into ridicule. No one saw her as the enforcer anymore. She was just another defendant waiting for her day in court. The HOA's reign had ended, not with a dramatic showdown, but with silence. The silence of an entire community finally free from its grip. And I knew this was only the beginning of their reckoning. The morning the court officially dissolved the HOA felt surreal. The community center, once a place where board members had barked orders and handed out fines, was now filled with residents waiting for the judge's ruling. When the order was read aloud, confirming the association's accounts were permanently seized, and its legal authority revoked, a wave of relief swept through the room. Some clapped, some cried quietly, and others simply sat back in stunned silence. For years, fear had been the currency of this neighborhood, and in one stroke it had been taken away. I walked out into the sunlight with a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow. My boat was gone, reduced to ashes in the water where I had once spent peaceful mornings, but standing at the marina later that day, I felt something I hadn't in months: peace. The dock was quiet, the water calm, and the neighbors who passed by no longer looked wary or defeated. Instead, they stopped to talk about rebuilding trust, about creating something voluntary and fair, something that didn't rely on intimidation. Karen was nowhere to be seen. She was now wrapped up in court dates and indictments, her empire dismantled piece by piece. The woman who once strutted down streets barking orders couldn't even show her face in public without reporters swarming. Her downfall wasn't dramatic flames like the ones that consumed my boat. It was quieter, but far more permanent. As for me, I wasn't looking for revenge anymore. Justice had already done its work. I thought about buying another boat, maybe restoring one from scratch, but the real victory wasn't on the water. It was in knowing that an entire community had been freed from the grip of corruption. They had tried to scare me with fire, but I had answered with cold, relentless truth. And in the end, truth won.